Imagine. It's 1491. England, barely recovered from the bloody wounds of the Wars of the Roses, yearns for stability. Henry VII, the triumphant founder of the Tudor dynasty, sits on a throne still warm from previous battles. He believes he has crushed every spark of rebellion. But suddenly, from the murky depths of European intrigue, a whisper spreads. A ghost. A prince thought dead. This is no mere rumor. It's a meticulously planned, devastating psychological weapon aimed directly at the heart of the new crown. At the center of this conspiracy stands a youth barely out of his teens, whose very existence is an insult, a challenge to royal authority. He is a nobody, a commoner, a Flemish pauper, some said. Yet with a chilling conviction that defied all common sense, this obscure figure dared to declare, "I am Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower, brutally murdered by my uncle, Richard III." Consider the sheer audacity of this claim. It was not merely a lie. It was an earthquake designed to shatter the very foundations of Tudor England. And the most shocking part? For years, the most powerful monarchs in Europe, from the Holy Roman Emperor to the King of France, not only tolerated this outrageous fantasy, but actively supported it, staking the fates of entire nations. How did this happen? What dark genius lurked behind the eyes of this absolute impostor? And what does it say about the fundamental fragility of power, when one audacious lie can plunge an entire continent into chaos? This is not just a story about an adventurer. It's a merciless analysis of how a personality capable of such a transformation is forged, and how the deepest vulnerabilities of human nature become targets in a game for the highest stakes. We've already seen how the ghost of a long-dead prince, or at least a cleverly crafted illusion of him, challenged the King of England himself. But how did a simple Flemish youth, whose origins were as humble as his future was predetermined, manage not only to claim the throne but also to convince entire kingdoms of this audacious lie? The answer lies not only in the political intrigues and lust for power of European monarchs, but also within Perkin Warbeck himself, in the depths of his psyche, in how his personality was formed, capable of such a grand transformation. Imagine Tournai, the city where Perkin was born, a bustling cauldron of the late Middle Ages, a crossroads of trade routes, languages, and cultures. Here, every day was a lesson in survival, every stranger a potential threat or opportunity. This was not an idyllic childhood, but rather a school of life where observation and adaptability were key. What did young Perkin see? Perhaps charlatans in the marketplaces, merchants changing their stories for profit, or actors capable of making a crowd laugh and cry. Perhaps it was there, amidst the noise and bustle, that the seed of an idea was planted in his nascent mind, that identity is merely a mask that can be put on or taken off. We can only speculate about the childhood traumas that might have propelled him down such a path. Was he rejected? Did he feel invisible? Insignificant? Or perhaps he was tormented by a keen, agonizing sense of his own ordinariness against the backdrop of the grand stories he might have heard. Sometimes the deepest trauma is not physical violence, but a mental void, a yearning to be someone when, by all accounts, you are nobody. This yearning could have become his driving force, pushing him to seek an identity that transcended his humble birth. And so the point of no return arrived. There wasn't a single moment when Perkin Warbeck suddenly decided to become a prince. It was a process, a slow descent into an abyss of lies from which there was no turning back. Perhaps it began with an innocent game, a joke, which was picked up by those who saw potential in him. And then, when the first powerful figures, those who yearned to weaken Henry VII, began to invest in him not just money, but also belief, the paths to retreat were cut off. Imagine the pressure. You are taught royal manners, the history of the House of York. You rehearse your role daily, and every step you take, every word you utter, is steeped in falsehood. At some point, this lie ceases to be merely a lie. It becomes your new reality, the only way to survive. This is how Perkin Warbeck transformed into a master of reinvention. It was not merely acting. It was a complete merging with the role. He had to not only speak like a prince, but also think like a prince, feel like a prince. He learned royal gestures, intonations, even how to hold himself on horseback or behave at the table. This required incredible self-discipline, psychological resilience, and perhaps profound self-deception. He had to convince himself that he was Richard to convince others. And the more powerful people believed him, the deeper he immersed himself in this fabricated persona. He became a living embodiment of political necessity, a puppet that learned to move independently. And it was this capacity for total transformation, this psychological immersion in the role of a prince, that allowed him to step onto the world stage, where he orchestrated some of history's most daring and dangerous deceptions, staking not only his life, but the destinies of entire nations. So the show began. From the moment Perkin Warbeck, or as he now called himself Richard of York, set foot on Irish soil in 1491, he ceased to be merely a Flemish youth. He became a living, breathing weapon, aimed at the heart of the new, still fragile Tudor dynasty. And his first performance, his Irish gambit, was not just a scam, but a daring roll of the dice in the great Game of Thrones. Ireland, that perpetual powder keg of the English crown, was the ideal stage for his debut. It was a land where the Yorkists were still almost revered, and the Tudors were strangers. Warbeck landed in Cork, and rumors of the saved prince instantly spread like wildfire. The locals, exhausted by decades of the Wars of the Roses, yearned for stability, or at least a familiar face on the throne. And there he was, young, stately, with a face that, many swore, strikingly resembled the late Edward IV, Richard's father. This was not just deception, it was wish fulfillment. His plan was simple: appear, declare himself, and allow the wave of Yorkist sympathies to carry him. And initially, it worked. The powerful Earl of Desmond, one of Ireland's most influential feudal lords, immediately recognized him. Then other Irish lords, those perpetual rebels who saw a chance for themselves in every English crisis, flocked to him. Even the all-powerful Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare, Lord Deputy of Ireland, while not officially recognizing him, did not obstruct him. He watched, waited, assessing how far this boy could go. This was Warbeck's first grand test, to convince not just a crowd, but cynical, seasoned politicians. And he passed it. Not perfectly, but convincingly enough to sow the seeds of doubt and hope. Ireland became his training ground, his first proving ground where he honed his legend, his manners, his ability to be the prince. But Ireland, though fertile ground, lacked the power to place him on the English throne. For that, far more powerful patrons were needed. And so, as if by magic, from the Irish bogs, he stepped into the gilded halls of European monarchs. The next stop, France. King Charles VIII, England's eternal rival, saw in Prince Richard an ideal tool to undermine Henry VII. This was the pure, unadulterated cynicism of high politics. It didn't matter who you truly were. What mattered was what you could offer, and Warbeck could give Charles VIII leverage against the hated Tudor. In 1492, Warbeck was received at the French court not merely as a fugitive, but as a true prince. He was provided with an honor guard, royal chambers, and treated with appropriate deference. This was more than the recognition of a single earl. It was international recognition. Suddenly, the Flemish commoner dined at the table with kings, participated in court intrigues, and his name, as well as his rights, were discussed in Europe's highest circles. His French charm, his demeanor, his convincing act, all of this transformed him from a regional phenomenon into an international threat. But the political landscape is as fickle as the tide. Charles VIII, having resolved his issues with Brittany and fearing war with England, suddenly changed his mind. In November 1492, the Treaty of Etaples was signed, and one of the key conditions for peace between England and France was the expulsion of Warbeck from French territories. Thus, with a single stroke of a pen, Prince Richard once again became a homeless exile, discarded from the game like used material. It was a harsh lesson. In the world of high politics, you are merely a pawn, easily sacrificed for a larger peace. But fate, or rather, the unseen puppeteers, did not abandon him. The most powerful and most convinced patron awaited him in the Netherlands. Margaret of Burgundy, sister of the late Edward IV and Richard III, a sworn enemy of Henry VII, became his mentor, his guardian angel, and his chief promoter. This was her masterclass in manipulation, her personal vendetta against the Tudors. It was in Burgundy, under Margaret's watchful eye, that Warbeck reached the peak of his power and his illusion. She publicly recognized him as her nephew, calling him the White Rose of England, the symbol of the Yorks. Margaret, a woman of iron will and deep hatred for Henry, didn't just acknowledge him, she trained him. She subjected him to interrogations, made him meet former York courtiers, those who had known the real princes. She wanted him to be flawless. And he was. He learned all the intricacies of royal etiquette, the history of his family, personal anecdotes and habits. He became so convincing that many who had known the real Richard swore it was him. He lived like a prince, attracting English exiles, discontented lords, and their money. Margaret's support opened doors to Europe's most powerful courts. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, head of a vast, though fragmented state, recognized him as cousin, accorded him honors, and even promised military aid. This was the apotheosis of his ascent. Europe buzzed with rumors. Conspiracies matured within England itself, fueled by news of a living prince who was about to return for his crown. Warbeck was at his peak, surrounded by splendor and promises, seemingly ready to crush the hated Tudor. But the peak of power is always a harbinger of decline. The first fatal error, the first crack in the carefully constructed illusion, occurred in 1495. Warbeck, instigated by his patrons, and perhaps his own inflated ego, attempted a landing in Kent. This was not a full-scale invasion, but rather a trial balloon, an attempt to raise a rebellion on English soil. But Henry VII, that master of espionage and counterintelligence, was a step ahead. His agents had long infiltrated the conspirators' ranks, and the Kent operation was doomed. When Warbeck's ships approached the shore, they were met not by cheering crowds, but by well-organized Tudor forces. Warbeck's landing party was routed, many captured and immediately executed. The prince himself, showing surprising cowardice, did not even set foot on English soil, but shamefully fled back to his ships. This disaster did not merely fail the invasion. It severely undermined his credibility. It exposed his inability to lead troops, his lack of courage, and most importantly, the invalidity of his supposed support within England. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Henry VII, enraged and emboldened, intensified pressure on Burgundy. He imposed a trade embargo known as the Magnus Intercursus, which severely hit Flemish merchants. Margaret, though she hated the Tudor, could not ignore the economic collapse. Under pressure from her stepson, Philip the Fair, ruler of Burgundy, she was forced to abandon her nephew. Warbeck was exiled again, deprived of his most powerful protection, his most influential voice. The golden age of his illusion had come to an end. He was once again homeless, but now branded a failure and a coward. This story is not just an account of one deceiver. It is a profound analysis of how easily power can be destabilized by a phantom, how monarchs use people as pawns, and how fragile the line is between reality and a meticulously constructed lie. But who truly stood behind this grand performance, pulling the puppet's strings? And who, in contrast, built their own invisible empire to crush this illusion? The answers to these questions lie deeper than they appear. So we have witnessed the birth of a monstrous deception. But Perkin Warbeck was merely the cover face, a beautifully printed mask for a much deeper and more sinister game. Behind him stood not just individuals, but an entire network of intrigues, woven from ambition, revenge, and cold calculation. This is not the story of a lone impostor, but a chronicle of a large-scale conspiracy, where each player pursued their own dirty ends, ready to sacrifice others' lives for their own gain. Let's start with the one who became his chief patroness, the true mother of this political chimera, Margaret of Burgundy. Sister of two kings, Edward IV and Richard III, she was not just a grieving aunt. The blood of the Yorks flowed in her veins, poisoned by the bitterness of defeat and a burning desire for revenge. Henry VII, the murderer of her brother and usurper of the throne, was her personal enemy. Her motives were simple and monstrous: to destroy the Tudors, restore the Yorks to the throne, and exact vengeance. Margaret used her colossal wealth and influence to create the ideal puppet. She didn't just teach Warbeck manners and history. She instilled in him the very soul of Richard of York, making him the living embodiment of a ghost who could shake Henry's throne. Her court in Mechlin became a hotbed of conspiracies, a refuge for all who hated the Tudors. She was the puppeteer who pulled the strings, guiding Perkin across Europe like a royal pawn on the chessboard of high politics. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. King Charles VIII of France, albeit briefly, also played his part in this dirty game. His motives were purely pragmatic: to weaken England so it would not interfere with his ambitions in Italy. He accepted Warbeck as a prince, granted him asylum, and even a small retinue. This was a blow to Henry, a demonstration that his position on the throne was still precarious. But diplomacy is the art of betrayal. When Charles VIII needed to solidify peace with England through the Treaty of Etaples, Warbeck became a bargaining chip, unwanted baggage. He was discarded, like a tiresome toy, showing the true price of his royal status in the eyes of real monarchs. Even Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, blinded by the prospect of an alliance against France, and perhaps genuinely misled, recognized Warbeck. But his support, too, was more symbolic than a real force. But Henry's most dangerous enemies were not overseas. They were in the very heart of England. These were men who had sworn allegiance to him, but remained loyal to the Yorks in their hearts, or simply craved power and wealth. Conspirators, among whom were those who held high positions at the Tudor court. Sir William Stanley, the king's Chamberlain, a man whose family had helped Henry VII win the Battle of Bosworth and ascend the throne, turned out to be one of them. His motives? Unsatisfied ambitions, perhaps envy of those who had gained more. He was ready to betray his king for the phantom hope of a Yorkist revival. Sir Robert Clifford, Lord Fitzwalter, Sir Simon Montfort, a whole pleiad of noble traitors who whispered in the shadows, sent letters and money, preparing to raise a rebellion. Their methods were vile: espionage, incitement, spreading rumors that fueled discontent against Henry. And this is where we see the true genius, or rather, the ruthless architect of counterintelligence, Henry VII. His motives were clear: to preserve the crown at all costs. He was paranoid, and not without cause. The Tudor throne was built on blood and instability, and Henry knew that the slightest crack could bring everything down. His methods of struggle were no less ruthless than the intrigues of his enemies. He created one of the most effective and merciless spy networks in European history. Lord Daubeny, Sir Richard Guilford, and later the infamous Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, these were his eyes and ears, his enforcers and extortionists. They infiltrated agents into Warbeck's circle, bribed, tortured, and extracted confessions. Henry was a master of economic warfare. His trade embargo against Burgundy, known as the Magnus Intercursus, became a crushing blow to Margaret, forcing her allies, such as Philip the Fair, to withdraw support for the impostor. He used diplomatic pressure to isolate Warbeck, transforming him from a prince into an exile, and of course he was ruthless to those he caught. Death awaited anyone who dared to challenge his authority. This multifaceted game, with the crown of England at stake, was gradually reaching its climax. Step by step, Henry dismantled the web of conspiracy, and each of Warbeck's failures, each arrest of a traitor, tightened the circle around the impostor. His patrons turned away, his allies were exposed. The network he had once used to bolster his lies now became a noose. And when that noose tightened, it became clear that for Perkin Warbeck, there would be no mercy, no escape. His path led to an inevitable end, where even the most skillful illusions crumbled to dust under the weight of harsh reality. When the last allies turned away and European courts slammed their doors shut, Perkin Warbeck, that living facade, found himself trapped. His grand deception, fueled by the ambitions of kings and the vengeance of dowager queens, approached its inevitable, bloody finale. The path back was cut off. Only one desperate gamble remained: a landing in England, hoping for the very popular uprising he could never truly inspire. In September 1497, abandoned to his fate, Warbeck landed in Cornwall. Why there? Because this region, plagued by unfair taxes and a recent rebellion, was a hotbed of discontent. It was his last, desperate attempt to light a fuse that might explode the Tudor throne. He gathered several thousand people, desperate, deceived, or simply yearning for change. Under the Yorkist flags, under the guise of Richard IV, he marched on Exeter. But this prince, who had so skillfully played his role at courts, proved to be a coward on the battlefield. When Henry VII, without losing a moment, moved his troops to meet him, and the city of Exeter refused to surrender, Warbeck faced a harsh reality. The siege of Exeter became his Golgotha. He was not a warrior. He was not a leader. His royal bearing, his feigned nobility, crumbled to dust in the face of real danger. On the night of September 21, 1497, under the cover of darkness, the Duke of York abandoned his followers and fled. He simply ran away, leaving behind only shame and confusion. This was not the gesture of a prince leading his troops, but the panic of an impostor whose mask had cracked. He fled to Beaulieu Abbey, seeking sanctuary. But Henry VII was not just a king. He was a predator who methodically tightened the noose around his prey. The spy network he had created scoured every corner of England. It was when Warbeck was most vulnerable that the mechanisms of betrayal, set in motion by Henry, finally worked. His agents, like Sir Robert Clifford, had long infiltrated the deepest layers of the conspiracy, identifying and bribing informants. Now, with Warbeck trapped and cornered, the last threads holding his supporters broke. Perhaps someone in his entourage, tired of his cowardice and desperation, or simply wanting to save their own skin, revealed his location. Soon, Warbeck was captured. From that moment, a cruel game of humiliation began. Henry didn't just want to execute Warbeck. He wanted to destroy the very idea of him. The prince was brought to London, not merely as a prisoner, but as a trophy. He was forced to publicly confess himself an impostor, to read a pre-written confession at St. Veit, Paul's Cross, and then at Westminster. Imagine the scene. A man who had for years played the role of heir to the throne now stood before a crowd, humiliated, broken, uttering words that destroyed his entire life. I, Perkin Warbeck, born in Tournai, acknowledge myself a liar and an impostor. Every syllable he uttered was a nail in the coffin of his grand lie. For Henry, this was a triumph not just over a rebel, but over the very concept of alternative authority. Warbeck was not executed immediately. He was placed in the Tower, where he likely lived in relative comfort, but under constant surveillance. Henry may have hesitated. A dead prince could become a martyr, a living one, merely a pathetic reminder of failure. But old habits die hard. Or perhaps this was a final, desperate, foolish calculation. In 1499, Warbeck attempted to escape from the Tower. It was a fatal error. He conspired with another prisoner, the unfortunate Edward, Earl of Warwick, the last direct male. Descendant of the Yorkists, who had spent his entire life in captivity. Was this plot a real escape attempt, or a trap set by Henry to eliminate both potential rivals? History loves such dirty tricks. Their conspiracy was uncovered. For Henry, this became the ideal pretext. Warbeck's trial was a farce, a sentence passed long before the proceedings. On November 23, 1499, Perkin Warbeck, the man who had lived another's life, ascended the scaffold at Tyburn. The crowd he had once tried to charm now came to watch his death. What did he feel in those last moments? Despair? Fear? Or perhaps for the last time he tried to wear the mask, attempting to die with the dignity befitting a prince? We can only guess. No fiery speeches, no last revelations. He simply died. Quietly. The execution of Warbeck, and then Warwick, finally solidified Henry VII's power, eradicating the last shadows of the Yorks. But even after his death, the shadow of Perkin Warbeck continued to linger over England, a reminder of the fragility of power and how easily a well-spun lie can become a destructive force. And this story, my friends, is not just about the past. It's about the nature of deception, about how the human yearning for power and recognition can be exploited, and how readily we are willing to believe what we want to believe. And this is just one aspect that connects this ancient intrigue with our own, equally entangled world. But what if I told you that the story of Perkin Warbeck did not end at Tyburn? That his execution was merely the final chord in a symphony of deceit that continues to resonate to this day, changing only its instruments and scenery? The lesson taught to us by this humble Flemish youth, who transformed into a prince, is far deeper than it seems. It is about the fragility of power, the power of persuasion, and how easily truth can be replaced by a carefully constructed reality. Look around. Do we not see Perkin Warbecks everywhere? Not necessarily claimants to a throne, but masters of manipulation, those who build careers and fortunes on the precarious foundation of others' hopes and fears. Modern politicians, whose images are crafted by armies of PR specialists and whose words are shaped by focus groups, are they not descendants of Warbeck? They sell us not their ideas, but a carefully curated illusion of whom we want them to be. They promise the moon, paint pictures of a bright future, and we, enchanted by the spectacle, are ready to believe. Or consider the countless gurus, financial fraudsters, and cult leaders who promise instant enlightenment, untold riches, or a path to salvation. Their methods are the same as Warbeck's: the exploitation of discontent, disappointment, that deep, almost primal yearning for something more, something better than the boring, inconvenient reality. They create a narrative in which you are the hero, and they are your guide. And people, desperately seeking meaning or escape, readily accept this lie because it offers something that is missing in their lives. Warbeck's story is not just a chronicle of medieval intrigue. It is an anatomy of deception. It is a demonstration of how easily a crowd, driven by emotion, rumor, and a belief in miracles, can be mobilized. Henry VII understood this. He knew that true victory was not just the physical elimination of a threat, but the complete eradication of the underlying idea. He forced Warbeck to publicly recant, not because he needed the truth from the impostor, but because he needed his truth, cemented in the national consciousness. It was not merely an execution. It was a ritual to solidify the official narrative. But the main, most uncomfortable question of this story is not directed at Henry, nor at Warbeck, nor even at Margaret of Burgundy. It is directed at us, at human nature. Why do we cling so desperately to untruths when they flatter our desires or confirm our biases? Why do we so often prefer a comforting lie to the bitter truth? And who, then, is the real impostor? The one who lies, or the one who is willing to be deceived?